June 4, 1942. American dive bombers had exactly 240 seconds to strike. Miss, Japan wins. Hit, war turns. This is those 4 minutes in real time. But to understand the sheer impossible weight of that single moment, you must first feel the terrifying scale of the force descending upon a tiny, forgotten atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Imagine the ocean, an endless, unforgiving blue desert stretching to the curvature of the Earth. And in its heart, a target so small, so strategically vital, it was nothing more than a speck on a map. Midway. The name itself was a promise, or a threat. This was the midway point between America and Japan, and whoever controlled it controlled the Pacific. But on this dawn, as a blood-orange sun bled over the horizon, it was the Empire of Japan that was coming in force, an armada of such devastating power it seemed to darken the very sea. 4 massive aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, flanked by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, formed the spearhead of an invasion fleet. Their mission was simple, and for the American sailors and pilots waiting nervously over the horizon, it was terrifyingly final. Obliterate the American resistance on Midway, draw out the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and crush them in a decisive battle that would leave the United States defenseless, suing for peace on Tokyo's terms. This was the culmination of Japan's 6-month rampage across the Pacific, a seemingly unstoppable tide of conquest. And for the Americans, reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor just months before, this was the last desperate stand. Everything was on the line. High above the American task force, hidden in a patch of cloud cover, flew Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. His cockpit was a bubble of intense focus, the only sounds the constant drone of his Dauntless dive bomber's engine and the crackle of his radio. He led a squadron of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, their wings heavy with 500-pound bombs. For hours they had flown, their fuel gauges dipping perilously low, scanning an empty ocean for a phantom enemy. Intelligence, a fragile code broken by brilliant minds in a Honolulu basement, had predicted this. It had given them a heading, a chance. But the ocean was vast, and the clock was ticking. A miscalculation of a few miles, a delay of a few minutes, and the Japanese fleet would slip away, its location lost, its strike force free to pummel Midway and then turn its wrath on the vulnerable American carriers. McCluskey's face was a mask of concentration, his eyes sweeping the endless blue below. His pilots were depending on him. The entire Pacific Fleet was depending on him. The fate of a nation rested on his ability to see what wasn't there, to find a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. Down on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, the atmosphere was a thick cocktail of aviation fuel, sweat, and raw tension. Men, young men, barely out of high school, moved with a frantic purpose, their faces smudged with oil, their ears ringing with the metallic clang of machinery and the roar of engines. They were the unsung heroes of this floating city at war, the deck crew who orchestrated the ballet of death and deliverance. In the ready room, pilots like Ensign George Tex Gay of Torpedo Squadron 8 sat strapped in their bulky flight gear, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear. They knew the statistics. They knew what happened to the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers. They were called flying coffins for a reason. Yet, when the order came, they stood, they marched to their planes, their hearts hammering against their ribs. This was not a movie. This was not a training exercise. This was the moment they had trained for, the moment they had dreaded, the moment that would define the rest of their lives, however short that might be. And then a crackle over the radio, a voice strained with urgency and disbelief. A scout plane had found them, the Japanese fleet. The coordinates were relayed, a set of numbers that sent a jolt of electricity through every pilot in the air. McCluskey banked his plane, his squadron following in a graceful, deadly arc. They had a heading. But as they flew, the horizon remained empty. More minutes ticked by. Precious fuel, the lifeblood of their mission, was burning away. The initial surge of hope began to curdle into a gnawing dread. Had they been wrong? Had the Japanese already moved? Were they flying into a void, only to be forced to ditch in the ocean, their mission a total failure? The stakes couldn't be higher. Back on the carriers, Admiral Chester Nimitz waited, his face granite, knowing he had bet it all on a hunch and the skill of his men. The entire American strategy was a house of cards, and the wind was rising. McCluskey pushed his plane further, his eyes fixed on the empty sea, his mind racing, calculating, praying for a miracle. He was running out of time, running out of ocean, running out of hope. And then, at the very limit of their range, at the absolute edge of despair, he saw it. A single, tiny, white feather on the vast blue canvas. A Japanese destroyer speeding north. It was a stray thread, and if he pulled it, the entire tapestry of the Japanese fleet would unravel. He made a decision that would change history. He turned to follow. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that high above him, another threat was forming. The skies were about to become a killing field, and his dive bombers were flying straight into the heart of it.
That single fleeing Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, was McCluskey's lifeline. It was a desperate gamble, a hunter following the spoor of a wounded animal back to its den. He led his 30-plus Dauntlesses north, the engines groaning in protest, the fuel gauges now dipping deep into the red. Every pilot knew what those needles meant. They were on a one-way trip. Either they found the enemy now, or they would be taking a long, cold swim in the middle of nowhere. The tension inside those cramped cockpits was a physical thing, a weight on the chest, a dryness in the throat. They flew on, the silence broken only by the monotonous drone and the increasingly tense reports over the radio. Then, on the horizon, a sight that made hearts stop and blood run cold. Not just ships, a city of ships. The entire Japanese Kido Butai, the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled, spread out below them in a formation of terrifying beauty and order. There they were, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Their massive flight decks, painted a dull yellow, looked like islands of arrogance in the blue sea. It was the jackpot, the ultimate prize, and it was utterly, horrifyingly defenseless. But that illusion of vulnerability was a trap. As McCluskey's bombers began their climb to gain altitude for the dive, the world below them erupted into chaos. The first wave of American attackers had already arrived. From the south, a swarm of antiquated torpedo bombers from Midway itself, slow, clumsy devastators, screamed in at wave-top height. They were slaughtered. Japanese Zero fighters, the finest naval fighters in the world, fell upon them like wolves on a herd of sheep. One by one, the American planes were torn apart, exploding into fireballs or cartwheeling into the sea, their torpedoes sinking harmlessly to the bottom. Not a single hit was scored. The sea was littered with burning wreckage and the bodies of brave men. The Japanese deck crews, who had been watching the massacre with a mixture of relief and bloodlust, cheered. Their combat air patrol was doing its job. Their fleet was invincible. On the bridge of the flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The American response was pathetic, disorganized. He had weathered the first storm. Now it was time to rearm his planes for a counterstrike against the American carriers whose location was now confirmed. This was the critical moment, the hinge upon which history would swing. The Japanese decks were a scene of organized pandemonium. Ordnance carts laden with bombs and torpedoes weaved between parked aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck. The planes that had just decimated the American torpedo bombers were landing, needing to be refueled and rearmed for the next mission. The decks were a tinderbox of high explosives and aviation fuel. And high above, unseen, McCluskey's Dauntlesses and those from the USS Yorktown were positioning themselves. They were the hammer, poised to fall on the anvil. But the timing was everything. They had to attack now, in this precise, fleeting window of opportunity, while the Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable, their decks crowded with planes, fuel, and bombs. If they attacked a minute earlier, the combat air patrol would have been higher, more alert. A minute later, and the decks might have been cleared. This was the 4-minute window. This was the entirety of the Pacific War, compressed into 240 seconds of sheer, unadulterated terror and opportunity. McCluskey, his fuel situation now critical, made the split-second decision. He would attack the two nearest carriers, the Kaga and the Akagi. He broke his squadron into 2 groups. There was no time for elaborate communication. A simple hand signal, a nod, and the fate of empires was sealed. The Dauntlesses nosed over into their near-vertical dives. The world for the pilots shrank to the view through their telescopic sights, the crosshairs fixed on the massive red suns painted on the enemy flight decks. The scream of the wind tearing at their wings, the G-forces pressing them into their seats, the deafening roar of their own engines. It was a sensory overload of pure adrenaline. They were committed. There was no turning back. Down below, the first warning came too late. A lone lookout on the Kaga pointed skyward, his mouth open in a silent scream. The Zeros were all down low, finishing off the torpedo planes. The sky above was clear and filled with death. The air raid sirens began to wail, a belated, useless shriek of alarm on the Japanese ships. The first American dive bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Dick Best, tipped over into its dive, aiming directly for the Akagi. The 4 minutes had begun. But as the first bombs fell, a new, terrifying drama was unfolding just over the horizon. The Japanese had not been idle. They had located the American carrier, the USS Yorktown. And from the deck of the Hiryu, a vengeful strike force was already in the air, turning the hunters into the hunted.
The world dissolved into a screaming vertical hell. For the American dive bomber pilots, the universe was reduced to a narrow, windswept cockpit, the crosshairs of their gun sight, and the ever-expanding deck of a Japanese aircraft carrier. The dive brakes were deployed, slowing their furious descent just enough to make them stable gun platforms. The sound was a physical assault, a shrieking, tearing roar as the wind clawed at the airframe, trying to rip the wings off. G-forces slammed them back into their seats, their vision tunneling, their bodies heavy. They were falling out of the sky at nearly 300 miles per hour, targets for every anti-aircraft gun the Japanese fleet could bring to bear. From below, the carriers and their escorting ships began to bloom with angry black puffs of smoke. The flak was intense, a storm of steel and fire rising to meet them. Tracers, glowing red and orange, streaked past their canopies, so close they could feel the heat. It was a descent into the inferno, a test of nerve that separated the boys from the legends. Lieutenant Dick Best of Scouting 6, leading his 3-plane section, had his sights locked on the Akagi. He ignored the flak, ignored the tracers, ignored the certain knowledge that death was only seconds away. His entire being was focused on that bright red circle on the flight deck. He had to time it perfectly. Release too high and the bomb would miss. Too low and he would never pull out of the dive. His altimeter unwound in a frantic spin. 4,000 feet, 3,500, 3,000. The carrier grew from a model into a massive, detailed warship. He could see the tiny figures of men scrambling, the parked planes, the chaos. He was so close he could almost see the whites of their eyes. At 2,500 feet, he pulled the release handle. The Dauntless lurched upward, suddenly 1,000 pounds lighter. He hauled back on the stick with all his strength, his body crushing under the G-forces, his vision graying out as he fought to pull his plane level above the wave tops. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He felt the concussion a second later, a deep, thunderous whump that shook his plane. He had hit. On the flight deck of the Akagi, the world ended not with a bang, but with a series of them. The first bomb, likely from Best's plane, struck near the center line, a direct hit that punched through the deck and exploded in the hangar below. The effect was cataclysmic. The hangar deck was a packed gallery of armed and fueled aircraft. The explosion touched off a chain reaction of hellfire. A second bomb hit the rear of the flight deck, obliterating the rudder and setting more aircraft ablaze. In an instant, the proud flagship was transformed into a raging furnace. Aviation fuel from ruptured lines poured across the deck, igniting into rivers of fire. Stored torpedoes and bombs, waiting to be loaded onto planes, began to cook off in secondary explosions, tearing the ship apart from the inside. The screams of the wounded and trapped were swallowed by the roar of the flames. Admiral Nagumo, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, was forced to abandon his bridge as the fires grew uncontrollable. His command center was gone. His flagship was dying beneath his feet. Simultaneously, the Kaga suffered an even more horrific fate. McCluskey's main force had concentrated on her, and she was hit by at least 4, possibly 5, 1,000-pound bombs in quick succession. The impacts walked across her deck in a line of apocalyptic destruction. One bomb landed squarely amid the parked aircraft forward, creating a firestorm that incinerated everyone on the bridge and the forward part of the ship. Another exploded deep within the hangar, detonating the fully armed and fueled planes. The Kaga became a vision from a nightmare, a pillar of black smoke and flames so high it seemed to scrape the sky. Men were blown overboard by the blasts, others were trapped by walls of fire, their only choice a leap into the oil-fouled water. The third carrier, the Soryu, was also found and savaged by Dauntlesses from the Yorktown. Hit by 3 bombs, she too was soon a crippled, burning wreck, dead in the water. In the span of those 4 minutes, the power dynamic of the entire Pacific War had been inverted. 3 of Japan's 4 premier carriers were mortally wounded. But the battle was far from over. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, hidden under a rain squall, had escaped the initial onslaught. And its commander, a determined and ruthless warrior, was now the last, best hope for the Empire of Japan. He had already launched his counterpunch. And now, that counterpunch was homing in on the USS Yorktown, its pilots fueled by a burning desire for vengeance. The Americans had landed a stunning blow, but they were about to find out the hard way that a wounded animal is the most dangerous of all. Aboard the USS Yorktown, the mood was a volatile mix of elation and grim anticipation. Radio reports from the returning scout planes spoke of 3 Japanese carriers burning, their flight decks shattered. Cheers had erupted across the deck. They had done it. They had achieved the impossible. But the seasoned officers knew better. They knew the Japanese still had 1 carrier unaccounted for, the Hiryu. And they knew that a cornered samurai fights with a ferocity unmatched. The ship's radar, a new and precious technology, swept the skies constantly. Lookouts scanned the horizons with powerful binoculars, their eyes straining for the first sign of the inevitable retaliation. The Yorktown's own combat air patrol of Wildcat fighters, low on fuel and ammunition after tangling with the first Japanese wave, was being recovered, refueled, and rearmed in a frantic ballet of efficiency. Every second counted. The ship was a hive of controlled chaos, preparing to either launch a final killing blow or weather a storm of its own. That storm arrived at noon. The radar operator's voice was calm but urgent over the ship's intercom. Bogies, bearing 320 degrees, Angels 15, 40 miles out. The air raid alarm sounded, a shrill, nerve-shredding klaxon that sent every man on the ship to his battle station. The mood shifted in an instant from cautious optimism to cold, hard reality. This was it. The Wildcats that were ready were scrambled, clawing for altitude to intercept. Below decks, damage control parties stood ready with hoses and pumps. The anti-aircraft gunners, young men like Seaman First Class Bruno P. Gaido, who had famously fought a Japanese plane from the cockpit of a parked scout plane months earlier, manned their stations, their knuckles white on the triggers. The sky, once a symbol of hope, was now the avenue of their potential destruction. The Japanese strike force, a mix of Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers escorted by a handful of Zeros, was a veteran group. They had already crippled the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and ravaged Allied shipping across the Pacific. They were skilled, determined, and enraged by the destruction of their sister ships. The American Wildcats met them 20 miles out, and a massive, swirling dogfight erupted high above the fleet. The sky was crisscrossed with contrails and the smoke of dying aircraft. But the Japanese pilots were too good, too disciplined. A group of Vals broke through the fighter screen. They ignored the other American carriers, focusing their entire wrath on the Yorktown. They nosed over into their dives. The ship's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, ordered hard turns, swinging the massive carrier left and right in a desperate attempt to spoil their aim. The entire ship leaned over at terrifying angles, its wake carving frantic S-shapes in the ocean. The anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the sky with a curtain of steel. The noise was deafening, the deep-throated pom-pom-pom of the 1.1-inch cannons, the sharper crack of the 5-inch guns, and the frantic chatter of the 50-caliber machine guns. Tracers reached up, a seemingly solid wall of fire. The first Val plummeted through the barrage, its wings on fire, but its pilot held his dive. He released his bomb, then cartwheeled into the sea. The bomb was a near miss, exploding close alongside the hull, its concussion shaking the ship violently and causing some minor flooding. But the next bomb was a direct hit. It smashed through the flight deck just aft of the island, exploding deep inside the ship. A massive fireball erupted, and black smoke poured from the wound. A second bomb hit the stack, disabling the boilers and reducing the ship's speed to a crawl. A third near miss close to the stern jammed the rudder. In minutes, the Yorktown was a cripple, listing to port, dead in the water and burning. The American counterstrike had been devastating, but the Japanese had drawn blood. The score was now 3 carriers to 1. But the Hiryu was still out there, its flight deck intact, and its commander was already planning a second, final strike to finish the Yorktown off for good. The battle had become a deadly duel, and the Americans had just lost their queen. Aboard the Yorktown, the world had become a nightmare of fire, smoke, and screaming metal. The bomb that hit the flight deck had torn a jagged hole, venting the inferno below into the sky. The hit on the stack had filled the engine rooms and fire rooms with noxious fumes, forcing the engineers to evacuate, gasping for air. Without steam, the great ship fell silent, a ghost ship adrift in a hostile ocean. The list increased, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. Water poured in from the near misses, flooding compartments on the port side. The heroic damage control parties fought back with a desperate courage, manning hoses against the blistering heat, shoring up bulkheads, and trying to restore power. Men coughed in the thick, acrid smoke, their faces blackened, their hands burned. Captain Buckmaster, on the bridge, directed the fight with a calm that belied the chaos around him. He knew the situation was critical, the ship was helpless, and the Japanese were not done with them yet. On the other American carriers, the Enterprise and Hornet, the celebration of the morning's victory had vanished, replaced by a cold, focused fury. The Yorktown was their sister, a symbol of American resilience, having been rushed back to service after being heavily damaged at Coral Sea. Now she was dying. But her sacrifice had bought them precious time and, crucially, had revealed the location of the last remaining Japanese carrier. Scout planes were launched, fanning out across the ocean. They had to find the Hiryu. They had to find her now, before she could launch a second strike that could cripple or sink another American flat top. The clock was once again the enemy. Intelligence from radio intercepts suggested the Hiryu was to the north. Every pair of eyes on every scout plane scanned the endless sea, knowing that the fate of the Yorktown and the entire task force depended on their sharp vision. They found her just after 2 p.m. A single, desperate radio message crackled through. Enemy carrier bearing 000 degrees, distance 90 miles. The Hiryu was located. On the Enterprise, the air group was already being prepared. This would be the knockout blow. A mixed strike force was hastily assembled, 24 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, including 10 from the orphaned Yorktown and 16 from the Hornet. There was no time for a coordinated, multi-pronged attack with torpedo bombers. This would be a pure dive bombing run, a repeat of the morning's miracle, but against a forewarned and desperate enemy. The pilots, many of whom had already flown one exhausting, nerve-shredding mission that day, clambered back into their cockpits. They were tired, they were running on adrenaline and rage, but they knew this was the most important mission of their lives. As the engines coughed to life and the planes were maneuvered into position for launch, the atmosphere was electric. This was for the Yorktown. Meanwhile, the Hiryu was a hive of frenetic activity. Her first strike had returned, reporting one American carrier definitely crippled. The mood was grimly triumphant. They had avenged their sisters. Now they had to finish the job. Admiral Yamaguchi, the Hiryu's commander, a brilliant and aggressive officer, ordered a second strike launched immediately to find and sink the other American carriers. As the planes were being spotted on the flight deck, the ship's radar and lookouts gave the warning. American planes were incoming. The Hiryu went into a hard turn, her escorting destroyers laying a smokescreen around her. Her combat air patrol, what was left of it, surged forward to intercept. The American dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, saw the smokescreen from miles away, a great gray smear on the horizon. They pushed their throttles forward, climbing for altitude. They knew the Zeros would be waiting. They knew the flak would be thick. The Hiryu had seen what happened to the other carriers. She would not be caught napping. As the American pilots rose to their attack position, they could see the tiny, angry shapes of Japanese fighters climbing to meet them. The final, decisive aerial duel of the Battle of Midway was about to begin. And for the men of the dying Yorktown, watching the shadows lengthen across the water, the sound of this distant battle would mean the difference between rescue and a watery grave.
The American dive bombers pressed on, a formation of grim determination against the vast Pacific sky. The Hiryu's Zeros, sleek and deadly, tore into them. The air became a chaotic swirl of twisting, turning aircraft. Machine guns chattered. Tracers lanced through the formation. An American Dauntless, its wings sheared off, spun away in a lazy, fatal cartwheel, trailing smoke and flame. Another followed. The cost of this attack was being paid in blood before they had even begun their dive. But the American pilots held their course, their discipline overriding their fear. They had to get through. They had to reach the dive point. Lieutenant Gallagher, leading the Enterprise group, ignored the fighters swarming around him, his eyes fixed on the smoke screen below. He was looking for a break, a glimpse of the carrier within. Then he saw it. A gust of wind parted the artificial fog, and for a few precious seconds the Hiryu was exposed, turning hard to starboard, her deck a clean, inviting target. "Earl to group, target in sight, follow me down." The order was crisp, calm, and with that, the Dauntlesses nosed over. The familiar, terrifying scream of the dive began again. For the Japanese gunners on the Hiryu, it was a nightmare repeating itself. They had heard the stories from the survivors of the other carriers, the helpless feeling of watching those black specks in the sky grow into angels of death. Now it was their turn. The anti-aircraft guns blazed, filling the sky around the diving planes with shrapnel. The Dauntlesses weaved slightly in their dives, making themselves harder targets, but their path was essentially a straight line to hell. The lead plane, Gallagher's, took a hit. Smoke poured from its engine, but he held his dive, his sights centered on the Hiryu's forward elevator. The first bomb was a direct hit, smashing through the forward part of the flight deck and exploding deep inside. The concussion rocked the entire ship. A second bomb hit amidships near the island, sending a fireball rolling across the deck. A third and then a fourth bomb struck in quick succession. The Hiryu was engulfed in flames from stem to stern. Just like her sisters, her hangar deck, packed with armed and fueled aircraft, became a crematorium. Secondary explosions began to rip her apart. In less than 5 minutes, the last operational carrier of the Kido Butai was transformed from a potent weapon of war into a burning, sinking wreck. The American pilots, pulling out of their dives at masthead height, raced away from the scene, their fuel gauges hovering on empty. They had done it. They had gotten all 4. But the battle's violence was not yet spent. As the American strike force limped home, the second Japanese strike from the Hiryu, launched just before the attack, was searching for the American fleet. They found the crippled Yorktown. Despite her list and her stationary position, her crew had performed miracles. Damage control had patched her up enough to get some boilers back online. The list had been partially corrected, and she was making a slow 5 knots. Her fighters, refueled and rearmed, put up a fierce defense, and her anti-aircraft gunners fought with the desperation of men who knew they were the last line of defense. But the Japanese torpedo bombers, the deadly Kates, pressed home their attack with suicidal bravery. They came in low and slow on both sides of the ship. 2 torpedoes slammed into the Yorktown's port side. The impact was catastrophic. The already damaged hull was torn open. Water poured in uncontrollably. The list returned, and this time it was fatal. At a list of 26 degrees, Captain Buckmaster gave the agonizing order: abandon ship. The men of the Yorktown, many of them wounded, some barely clothed, began the orderly but heartbreaking process of leaving their vessel. They slid down ropes into the oily, cold water, where waiting destroyers picked them up. They watched from the safety of the rescue ships as their proud carrier, the ship that had been their home and their fortress, lay on her side, a mortally wounded beast waiting for the end. The American fleet had won a monumental victory, but it had come at a terrible cost. And as night fell over the Pacific, the darkness was filled with the sounds of men in the water, the groaning of dying ships, and the sobering knowledge that the war was far from over. The Japanese fleet, though shattered, was still out there, and its commander, Admiral Yamamoto, was now faced with a choice: retreat and admit a defeat from which Japan could never recover, or close for a night surface engagement, a desperate gamble with the remnants of his once mighty battle line. The battle for Midway had been won in the air, but the night belonged to the surface fleet. and the dark waters held one last deadly secret.
The silence that fell over the battlefield was deceptive, broken only by the crackle of distant fires and the gentle lap of waves against life rafts. For the survivors of the Yorktown, huddled on the decks of destroyers like the USS Hammond and Balch, it was a silence of shock and exhaustion. They stared into the darkness at the dark, listing silhouette of their ship, a ghost already. They had lost friends, their home, and a part of themselves in that cold water. But amidst the grief, there was a fierce, burning pride. They had taken a horrific pounding and had given better than they got. Their sacrifice had drawn the enemy's fury, allowing the Enterprise and Hornet to deliver the killing blows. On those two intact carriers, the mood was somber but resolved. The air groups were decimated, the pilots pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. They had flown 2, some 3 missions in a single day. They slept where they collapsed, in ready rooms or on the hangar deck, still in their flight gear, the stench of smoke and sweat clinging to them. But the sea at night is a place of shadows and threats. The American command, Admiral Spruance and Fletcher, knew the Japanese were not finished. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, was still at sea with the main body of the Japanese fleet, including the powerful battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Mutsu. His original plan, a complex trap, had been utterly shattered. But he was a gambler. Radio intercepts suggested he was ordering his remaining forces to converge on the American position for a night surface battle. This was the Japanese specialty, brutal, close-quarters naval combat, where their superior night-fighting optics and long-lance torpedoes could annihilate the American carriers, which had no battleships to protect them. The American task force was at its most vulnerable. They had won the day, but they could still lose the war in the dark. Aboard the American ships, general quarters was sounded. The night was pitch black, a new moon hiding the carnage of the day. Lookouts peered into the inky blackness, their night vision ruined by the sudden flashes of battle just hours before. Every sensor, every pair of eyes was strained to its limit. A sonar contact, a radar blip, anything could be the prelude to an attack. The American destroyers formed a protective screen around the precious carriers, their crews tense at their torpedo tubes and guns. The captains on the bridges spoke in hushed tones, their orders crisp and quiet. They were sailing into the unknown, aware that somewhere out there in the vast darkness, a powerful enemy force was hunting them. The victory of the day felt 1,000,000 miles away. This was a different kind of fight, a primal, terrifying game of cat and mouse on a blacked-out ocean. Meanwhile, the Japanese were in disarray, but not without teeth. The cruiser Mogami and her sister ship Mikuma, part of a bombardment group meant to shell Midway, had collided into chaos while trying to evade an American submarine. Both were damaged, trailing oil, and struggling to keep up with the retreating main force. They were the wounded stragglers of the herd. And they were being tracked. American PBY Catalina flying boats, slow but sturdy, were patrolling the night skies, their crews using radar to search for targets. They found the 2 crippled cruisers. A report was radioed back to the American task force. Here was a target of opportunity, a chance to add to the day's staggering tally. But for the American commanders, it was a dilemma. Pursue the wounded and risk being drawn into Yamamoto's battleship trap? Or withdraw to the east, preserving the carriers and securing the victory? It was a decision that required nerves of steel. One wrong move, and the glorious victory of June 4th could be undone before the sun rose on June 5th. The night held its breath, waiting for the next move in this deadly game. Meanwhile, the Japanese were in disarray, but not without teeth. The cruiser Mogami and her sister ship Mikuma, part of a bombardment group meant to shell Midway, had collided in the chaos while trying to evade an American submarine. Both were damaged, trailing oil, and struggling to keep up with the retreating main force. They were the wounded stragglers of the herd. And they were being tracked. American PBY Catalina flying boats, slow but sturdy, were patrolling the night skies, their crews using radar to search for targets. They found the 2 crippled cruisers.
A report was radioed back to the American task force. Here was a target of opportunity, a chance to add to the day's staggering tally. But for the American commanders, it was a dilemma. Pursue the wounded and risk being drawn into Yamamoto's battleship trap? Or withdraw to the east, preserving the carriers and securing the victory? It was a decision that required nerves of steel. One wrong move, and the glorious victory of June 4th could be undone before the sun rose on June 5th. The night held its breath, waiting for the next move in this deadly game.
Dawn on June 5th broke over a quiet, empty sea. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now in sole command after Fletcher had been forced to abandon the Yorktown, had made his decision. He would not be lured into a night battle against Yamamoto's battleships. It was a conservative, brilliant choice. He had turned his task force eastward during the night, away from the perceived threat, preserving his carriers. The gamble had paid off. The Japanese search planes found nothing the next morning. The American fleet had vanished. Yamamoto, realizing his trap had failed and that his carrier force was destroyed, gave the order for a general withdrawal. The Imperial Japanese Navy was in full retreat. The battle was over. The victory was secure. But war is never that clean. With the main threat gone, Spruance turned his attention to the wounded. The Yorktown, though abandoned, was still stubbornly afloat. Her list had stabilized. A salvage party, led by the indomitable Captain Buckmaster, was assembled and sent back aboard from the destroyer USS Hammond, which came alongside to provide power and pumping capacity. It was a ghostly return. The ship was silent, her decks tilted at a crazy angle, littered with debris and the detritus of a sudden evacuation. The men set to work, fighting to save their ship. They jettisoned topside weight to correct the list, and the Hammond supplied power for the pumps, which began spewing thousands of gallons of water back into the sea. For a few hours, hope flickered. The Yorktown seemed to be winning her fight for life. At the same time, American air patrols were sent out to find the retreating Japanese. They found the crippled cruisers Mogami and Mikuma limping away at a painfully slow speed, their wakes a telltale slick of fuel oil. This was a chance for revenge, for a final exclamation point on the victory. Dive bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet were launched. They fell upon the two wounded ships like hawks. The Mogami took the brunt of the punishment. Hit by multiple bombs, her fires raged out of control, igniting the torpedoes in her deck mounts. A massive explosion tore her apart, and she sank later that day, taking most of her crew with her. It was a grim postscript, a demonstration of the utter totality of the American victory. The Mogami, though terribly damaged, managed to escape, a floating wreck that would take years to repair. But back at the Yorktown, tragedy struck one last time. The Japanese submarine I-168, which had been stalking the American fleet, slipped through the destroyer screen. It lined up a perfect shot. 4 torpedoes streaked through the water. One passed directly under the Hammond, which was tied alongside the Yorktown, and hit the destroyer amidships. The little ship was broken in two and sank in minutes, taking many of her crew with her. 2 more torpedoes slammed into the Yorktown's starboard side, the side that was already exposed by her list. It was the final blow. The salvage party was forced to abandon ship once more. The great carrier, having endured more than any ship should ever have to, finally gave up the fight. On the morning of June 7, 1942, the USS Yorktown rolled over and sank beneath the waves, to a depth of 16,600 feet. Her passing was watched in silence by the men she had saved. She was a testament to American ingenuity and courage, a ghost that would haunt the depths of the Pacific, a permanent memorial to the price of victory at Midway. The battle was truly over. The 4-minute window had been seized, and the world had been changed forever. But for the men who lived through it, the memories of fire, fear, and fallen friends would last a lifetime. The tide had turned, but the war was just beginning. The silence that followed the Yorktown's final descent was a sound unto itself, a vast, hollow emptiness that swallowed the cheers of victory and replaced them with the sobering weight of sacrifice. For the men on the rescue ships, watching the churning air bubbles and the last slick of oil mark the carrier's grave, the triumph of Midway felt distant and abstract. They had lost a home. They had lost friends. The sea, now calm and indifferent, had claimed a Titan. A lone sailor on the deck of a destroyer slowly removed his cap, a gesture mirrored by dozens around him, a silent, spontaneous funeral for a ship that had refused to die until her final gasping breath. The cost of those 4 minutes was etched on every face, in every pair of exhausted, hollow eyes. They had won, but God, the price. Yet, even in that moment of profound loss, the strategic picture was crystallizing with breathtaking clarity. The American cryptographers, the intelligence officers, the admirals, they began to piece together the full scope of what had been achieved. The Kido Butai, the very fist of the Japanese Empire, had been shattered. 4 frontline aircraft carriers, the heart of Japan's naval air power and the spearhead of its expansion, were at the bottom of the Pacific. Over 322 Japanese aircraft were gone, but more importantly, an entire generation of highly trained, irreplaceable pilots, the soul of their naval aviation, had been wiped out. This was a wound from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never truly recover. The initiative, seized at Pearl Harbor, had been violently wrenched from their hands. The war had not just been paused, it had been fundamentally altered. The rising sun of Japan had reached its zenith and was now, irrevocably, beginning to set. Aboard the surviving American carriers, the atmosphere was one of grim exhaustion. The flight decks, normally scenes of organized chaos, were eerily quiet. The air groups were skeletons. Empty ready rooms told the story of the pilots who would not be returning. Mechanics worked tirelessly to repair the few remaining aircraft, their tools ringing in the quiet. In the wardrooms, officers pored over maps, the adrenaline of battle replaced by a deep, bone-weary fatigue. They had done the impossible. They had stopped the unstoppable. But looking at the shortened list of available pilots and planes, they knew this was not the end. It was a beginning. The United States now had the opening it desperately needed, a chance to go on the offensive, to start the long, hard climb back across the vast expanse of the Pacific. The first step on that island-hopping road to Tokyo had been taken here, on the blood-stained waters around Midway. And what of the Japanese? The retreat was a funeral procession. Aboard the mighty battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, received the final catastrophic reports in stoic silence. His elaborate plan, a masterpiece of misdirection and overwhelming force, had collapsed into ash and ruin. The news was beyond comprehension. 4 carriers lost. The invasion of Midway aborted. The American fleet, which he had been so sure he would destroy, had not only survived, but had administered a defeat of historic proportions. He knew, with a chilling certainty that settled in his gut, that this was the turning point. Japan could not replace these ships or these men at the same rate as the industrial behemoth that was the United States. The war was lost. The only question now was how long and at what cost the nation would continue to fight. The mood across the retreating fleet was one of shock and disbelief, a national trauma unfolding on the open ocean. The samurai had been outdueled, and the shame of it was a poison in the water. But for the American sailors and Marines on Midway itself, the battle had a more immediate, tangible relief. For days, they had endured relentless air attacks, watched their comrades die, and braced for a naval bombardment and invasion that would have surely overwhelmed them. Now, the skies were clear of enemy planes. The sea was empty of enemy ships. The threat was gone. They emerged from their bunkers and gun emplacements, squinting in the sunlight, their ears still ringing from the concussions of bombs and anti-aircraft fire. They saw the smoke stains on their sand, the wreckage of their own planes, the fresh graves. But they were alive. The atoll had held. The line held. Their stubborn, defiant resistance had played its part, forcing the Japanese to alter their plans, to rearm their planes, to create that fatal 4-minute window. They were the anvil upon which the American hammer had fallen. And as they looked out at the peaceful, empty horizon, they allowed themselves a feeling they had not felt in a long time: hope. But even that hope was tempered by a new, grim realization. The enemy was wounded, but not dead. And a wounded enemy is always the most dangerous. The Pacific was still a vast Japanese stronghold, and the next battle was already being planned in headquarters thousands of miles away. The victory was complete, but the war was waiting. The return to Pearl Harbor was not a triumphant parade. It was a somber homecoming for a battered fleet. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet sailed into the familiar channel, their decks scarred and empty, their crews lining the rails not as conquering heroes, but as survivors. They passed the still-wrecked battleships from the December 7th attack, a stark reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The cheers from the dock were respectful, muted. The men who disembarked walked with a slow, heavy tread. They had seen things, done things that would haunt their dreams for decades. The laughter was too sharp, the silences too long. They were old men in young bodies, their youth sacrificed in the screaming dive over a Japanese carrier. In the intelligence headquarters at Pearl, the mood was different, a quiet, professional fervor. The codebreakers, the men and women of Station Hypo, led by the brilliant and eccentric Commander Joseph Rochefort, finally emerged from the shadowy world of ciphers and intercepts. They had been the architects of this victory. Their correct analysis of the target, AF is Midway, had allowed Nimitz to gamble his entire fleet and win. But there were no medals waiting for them, no public adulation. Their work remained top secret, a weapon too precious to reveal. They celebrated with coffee and a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that their unsung battle of wits had saved thousands of lives and changed the course of the war. Then they went back to work. The Japanese codes would change now. The ciphers would become more complex. The next battle of intelligence was already beginning. For the American public, the news was a thunderbolt. U.S. victory at Midway, screamed the newspaper headlines. After 6 months of relentless bad news, Pearl Harbor, the fall of the Philippines, the retreats across the Pacific, this was a jolt of pure, undiluted hope. President Roosevelt, a master of morale, framed it as a testament to American courage and ingenuity. But the details were scarce, the losses downplayed. The public celebrated the sinking of 4 Japanese carriers. They did not see the burning wreck of the Yorktown or the empty seats in the mess halls of the Enterprise. They did not hear the screams of the pilots in their dying dives. The victory was clean, the cost sanitized for public consumption. It was a necessary myth, a story of heroism to fuel the war effort on the home front, where factory shifts lengthened and victory gardens sprouted in every backyard. The nation, unified by a shared purpose, felt its sparring stiffen. They could win this thing. But in the quiet offices of the Navy Department in Washington, the strategic planners were already looking at the map with new, aggressive eyes. The victory at Midway had secured Hawaii. It had broken Japanese offensive power. Now it was time to test their defenses. The focus shifted south to a fetid, malaria-ridden island in the Solomon Islands that most Americans had never heard of, Guadalcanal. Here, the Japanese were building an airfield. From that airfield, they could threaten the sea lanes to Australia. It could not stand. Midway had been a defensive victory, a masterpiece of counterpunching. Guadalcanal would be the first offensive, a brutal, bloody test of whether the United States could project power across the Pacific and take back what the enemy held. The plans, drawn in red and blue pencil on large maps, were ambitious, risky. They would have to land Marines on a hostile shore, supply them under constant air and naval attack, and hold against ferocious Japanese counterassaults. It would be a meat grinder. And for the pilots and sailors who had fought at Midway, there was no rest. There was no long leave, no parade through New York City. There were only repairs, re-equipping, and new orders. The Enterprise and Hornet, the only operational carriers left in the Pacific, were needed immediately. The war would not wait for them to grieve. New green pilots fresh from training in Florida and California reported aboard, their faces eager and unlined, a stark contrast to the hollow-eyed veterans who had survived the dive into hell. These new men listened to the stories of Midway with a sense of awe, not quite comprehending the reality of the fear, the chaos, the smell of burning fuel and death. They were replacements, fodder for the next battle. The veterans looked at them with a mixture of pity and resignation. They would learn, or they would die. The 4-minute window had won the Pacific War a chance, but it was now up to them, the survivors, to storm through that window and into the bloody years ahead. The reckoning had begun, but the bill was far from paid. The transition from the open ocean Battle of Midway to the impending jungle hell of Guadalcanal was jarring, a shift in the very nature of the war. For the crew of the USS Enterprise, the Big E, there was no time to process the trauma of the past week. The ship, still scarred and bearing the spiritual wounds of lost comrades, was ordered south at flank speed. The Pacific changed color, from the deep, clear blue of the Central Ocean to the murky, green-tinged waters of the Coral Sea. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the fecund smell of land and decay. They were entering a new battleground, one defined not by the clean lines of carrier duel, but by the tangled, close-quarter savagery of land, sea, and air combat intertwined. The stakes were just as high, but the arena was infinitely more complex and cruel. On August 7, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, the United States launched its first major amphibious assault of the war. The sight that greeted the men on the ships was one of breathtaking audacity. A vast armada of transports and warships lay off the dark, mountainous coast of Guadalcanal. The pre-dawn bombardment lit up the sky, the thunder of naval guns rolling across the water like a continuous storm. Then the landing craft, a swarm of tiny, vulnerable boats, churned towards the beaches. The Marines of the 1st Division, many of them seeing combat for the first time, crouched low, their hearts pounding, their mouths dry. They expected a bloodbath. They hit the beaches and found them mostly empty. The Japanese construction troops and naval guards had fled inland away from the terrifying naval shelling. The Marines quickly secured the airfield, which they christened Henderson Field in honor of a pilot lost at Midway. The initial landing was a stunning success. It seemed almost too easy. But the Japanese response was swift and violent. From the massive naval base at Rabaul, hundreds of miles to the north, waves of Betty bombers and Zero fighters took to the air. Their target, the American invasion fleet. And standing in their way, the only American carrier in the area, was the weary but battle-hardened USS Enterprise. The air over Guadalcanal, soon to be nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound for the number of ships that would litter its floor, became a new killing field. The Enterprise's combat air patrol, a mix of veteran Midway pilots and terrified newcomers, engaged the incoming raiders. The skies filled with the crisscrossing trails of dogfights, the black puffs of flak, and the terrifying sight of Japanese bombers plunging through the barrage towards the precious transports. The Enterprise herself became a target. Her fighters, her anti-aircraft gunners, her damage control parties, all were tested once again in a relentless day-after-day battle of attrition. This was not a single decisive clash, this was a siege. And on the island, the easy victory evaporated as quickly as a tropical rain shower. The Japanese, recognizing the grave threat of an American airfield in the heart of their defensive perimeter, committed to throwing the invaders back into the sea. At night, fast Japanese warships, the Tokyo Express, would run down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, to bombard Henderson Field and land fresh troops. The Marines, dug in around the airfield's perimeter, lived in a state of constant tension. The jungle itself seemed to be their enemy, a dark, impenetrable wall that hid a fanatical foe. The nights were filled with the screech of insects, the distant thunder of naval guns, and the sudden, terrifying scream of a Japanese banzai charge. The war had become primal, a fight for every inch of muddy, blood-soaked ground. The victory at Midway had made Guadalcanal possible, but it could not prepare these men for the horror that awaited them in the steamy, disease-ridden jungles. The strategic initiative had been seized, but holding it was proving to be a nightmare. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August 1942 was, in many ways, Midway's bloody sequel. The Japanese sent a powerful carrier force centered on the Shokaku and Zuikaku, the veterans of Coral Sea who had missed Midway, to smash the American invasion and sink the Enterprise. Once again, scout planes dueled in the clouds, searching for the enemy. Once again, the fate of a campaign rested on the skill of dive bomber pilots and the resilience of a flight deck. The Enterprise was found first. Japanese Val dive bombers broke through the fighter screen and plummeted down on the carrier. This time, there was no miraculous escape. 3 bombs hit the Big E in quick succession. The first smashed through the aft flight deck, exploding deep inside. The second hit forward near the island. The third was a near miss that shook the ship violently. Fires erupted. Men died. The ship shuddered to a stop, listing precariously. This was the moment the Japanese had been waiting for since June 4th. Revenge for Midway was within their grasp. The order was given to finish her off. But the Enterprise was a tough old bird, and her crew was now a brotherhood forged in the fires of multiple battles. Damage control parties, led by hardened chiefs who had seen it all before, fought the blazes with a desperate, practiced efficiency. They jettisoned ammunition, shored up bulkheads, and patched the flight deck. Meanwhile, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Saratoga had located the Japanese carrier Ryujo, a lighter carrier accompanying the main force. They pounced on it, scoring multiple hits and sending it to the bottom. The attack on the larger Japanese carriers was less successful, but it was enough. The Japanese admiral, fearing further losses, broke off the engagement. The Enterprise, though grievously wounded, had survived. She limped away from the battle, her decks a shambles, but her spirit unbroken. She was lived to fight another day, but she was headed for a long overdue repair in a stateside dockyard. Back on Guadalcanal, the survival of the Enterprise was more than a naval victory. It was a lifeline. As long as American carriers could contest the skies, the Marines on Henderson Field had a chance. The Cactus Air Force, a motley collection of Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force planes operating from the muddy, bomb-cratered airstrip, became the garrison's guardian angels. These pilots lived in conditions as brutal as the infantry, fighting off malaria and dysentery by day and Japanese bombers by night. They flew until they were killed or too exhausted to continue. Every plane that landed on Henderson Field was a victory. Every Japanese bomber they shot down was a transport saved, a bombardment run broken up. The battle had become a brutal war of supply and attrition. The Americans held the airfield. The Japanese controlled the sea at night. It was a bloody stalemate, a test of national will. And in the waters around the island, the surface fleet fought a series of brutal, close-range night actions that were among the most savage in naval history. In the pitch black of Iron Bottom Sound, American and Japanese cruisers and destroyers blasted away at each other at point-blank range, their guns flashing like giant camera strobes, illuminating hellish scenes of twisting metal and towering waterspouts. The USS Atlanta, the USS Juno, the Japanese battleship Hiei, dozens of ships from both sides were sunk, their crews left to the sharks in the treacherous currents. The losses were staggering, the violence impersonal and absolute. This was the dark underside of the victory at Midway, the grim, bloody price of taking back the Pacific foot by bloody foot. The 4-minute window had granted the Americans the right to fight this battle, but it could not spare them the horror of it. The easy war was over. The hard war had begun. The grind. On Guadalcanal stretched from weeks into months, a relentless cycle of attack and counterattack, bombardment and disease. The Marines, now reinforced by soldiers from the Army, held a shrinking perimeter around Henderson Field, their bodies wasted by malnutrition and illness, their nerves frayed by constant shelling and the threat of infiltration. The Japanese, pouring in fresh troops from the Tokyo Express, launched one furious assault after another against the American lines. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, the battle for the Matanikau, the massive October offensive, each was a desperate attempt to overrun the airfield. Each time, the American lines, though bent and battered, held. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, a brutal melee of bayonets, rifle butts, and grenades in the dark, tangled jungle. The stench of death hung over the island, a pervasive miasma that no tropical rain could wash away. The naval battles continued with undiminished ferocity. The night of November 12 to 15, 1942, saw the decisive naval engagement of the campaign, a sprawling, chaotic melee that involved 2 American admirals being killed and the battleships USS South Dakota and USS Washington taking on a Japanese bombardment force. In a stunning display of radar-directed gunnery, the Washington silently tracked the Japanese battleship Kirishima and opened fire at point-blank range, hammering it with dozens of 16-inch shells until it was a burning wreck. This victory broke the back of Japan's attempts to neutralize Henderson Field with naval bombardment. From that point on, the Americans began to slowly gain the upper hand in the waters around Guadalcanal. The supply lines, though still dangerous, became more secure. Fresh troops and supplies flowed in. The Japanese, on the other hand, were starving, diseased, and cut off. By January 1943, the outcome was inevitable. The Japanese High Command, faced with unsustainable losses and the utter exhaustion of their troops on the island, made the agonizing decision to evacuate. In a brilliantly executed operation, they managed to withdraw over 10,000 surviving soldiers from the island under the cover of darkness, an operation the Americans dubbed the Tokyo Night Express. On February 9, 1943, after 6 months of the most brutal combat the Pacific had yet seen, the Americans declared Guadalcanal secure. The island was theirs. The first offensive had succeeded. The Marines and soldiers who had endured the nightmare emerged from the jungle as hardened veterans, their faces gaunt, their eyes old. They had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked. The strategic ramifications were profound. The victory at Guadalcanal, built upon the foundation of Midway, secured the line of communication to Australia. It bled the Japanese of airmen, ships, and veteran infantry they could not replace. Most importantly, it cemented the new American way of war, the combined arms assault of amphibious landings, naval gunfire support, and carrier-based air power. The United States had not only stopped the Japanese advance, it had now proven it could take territory back. The momentum was irreversible. The long island-hopping road to Japan was open. The names of these islands, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, loomed on the horizon, each promising a new level of bloodshed. But the men who had fought at Midway and Guadalcanal had shown the way. They had proven that the Japanese soldier was not a Superman, that the Japanese Navy was not invincible. They had turned the tide. Now, it was just a matter of pushing it all the way back to the enemy's doorstep. The legacy of those 4 minutes off Midway on June 4, 1942, is not just written in history books, it is etched into the very geography of the modern world. It was a victory of intellect, where codebreakers armed with slide rules outperformed samurai swords. It was a victory of courage, where young men from farms and cities across America stared into a wall of flak and held their dives. It was a victory of command, where admirals like Nimitz and Spruance had the wisdom to trust their intelligence and the nerve to risk everything on a single desperate throw of the dice. In that brief, explosive window, the entire narrative of the Pacific War was rewritten. The story of Japanese invincibility was shattered, replaced by a new saga of American resilience and industrial might. For the men who were there, the battle never really ended. Dick Best, the pilot who likely delivered the fatal blow to the Akagi, saw his flying career end that day. He had accidentally inhaled caustic soda from a faulty oxygen canister and spent the rest of the war in a sanatorium, his lungs permanently damaged. Wade McCluskey, the leader who found the enemy against all odds, continued to serve with distinction, but he always carried the weight of the men he led who did not return. The survivors of Torpedo Squadron 8, who were virtually annihilated, became living ghosts, a permanent reminder of the cost of the victory. They came home to a grateful nation, but they carried the memories of the burning carriers, the oil-fouled water, and the faces of their friends like a shroud they could never remove. Their heroism was a burden as much as an honor. And what of the ships? The Enterprise, the galloping ghost, survived the war, earning 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship. She became a legend, a symbol of the Navy in the Pacific. But she too was ultimately scrapped, her steel melted down, her spirit living on only in memory and history. The Yorktown and the 4 Japanese carriers remain where they fell, in the cold, dark silence of the deep Pacific. Their hulls now artificial reefs, their guns silent, their flight decks home to strange, deep-sea creatures. They are war graves, sacred sites, where the ghosts of thousands of sailors still stand their watch. Expeditions have visited them, sending back haunting images of silent anti-aircraft guns and aircraft elevators frozen in time, poignant reminders of the fury that once raged there. The Battle of Midway did not win the war. The bloody, grinding work of Guadalcanal, the Central Pacific Drive, the submarine campaign, and the eventual atomic bombs would do that. But Midway made victory possible. It was the pivot, the moment when the unstoppable force met the immovable object, and the immovable object held. It gave America the time it needed to unleash its industrial juggernaut, to build the ships, the planes, and the guns that would eventually overwhelm the Japanese Empire. It was a testament to the idea that in war, luck favors the bold, and that courage, when combined with intelligence and determination, can change the world in the space of a single deep breath. Those 240 seconds were not just a military engagement. They were a crucible in which the fate of nations was forged. And the men who lived through them, who fought and died in that screaming dive, ensured that the dawn of June 4th would not be the beginning of America's end, but the beginning of the end for an empire of the rising sun. The window was open. The road home, though long and bloody, now lay ahead.